Scotland, 1944. The air raid siren cut through the afternoon like a knife, its wail rising and falling across the hills surrounding the prisoner camp near Inverness. In the dining hall, 40 German women froze mid-sentence, spoons suspended over bowls of soup, faces turning toward windows that showed nothing but grey sky. They had been told what to expect during RAF raids. Chaos, buildings collapsing, guards abandoning their posts to save themselves, prisoners left to burn or suffocate in the rubble. What happened instead in the next 20 minutes made them question everything they'd been taught about British cowardice, about how democracy fails under pressure, about what enemies do when disaster strikes and no one is watching. The journey had begun 4 months earlier on a rain-soaked morning in occupied Belgium. Helena Brandt stood among 120 women in a converted warehouse outside Brussels, her Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform still damp from 3 days of hiding in ditches as Allied forces swept through the countryside. She was 29, a meteorologist who had worked at a Luftwaffe weather station tracking conditions for bombing missions across the Channel. Around her, radio operators who'd transmitted coordinates for V-weapon launches, clerks from administrative offices in Antwerp, nurses who'd treated German wounded in field hospitals from Normandy to the Rhine, even a chemist from Munich who'd been testing synthetic rubber compounds when the front collapsed around her laboratory. They had expected summary execution. The propaganda had been explicit. The British were butchers who respected no conventions, who had invented the concentration camp in the Boer War, and would gladly revive such methods for German prisoners. The Allies showed no mercy to women who had served the Reich, especially those who had contributed to military operations. Better to die quickly than fall into British hands. Instead, they received British Army greatcoats against the rain, medical examinations by female personnel, and rough wool dresses stamped with PW across the shoulders in white paint. The letters felt like a sentence, marking them as property of His Majesty's government, stripping away identity and nationality alike. The ship crossing to Britain was nightmare enough to erase hope. Darkness in the hold, diesel fumes thick enough to choke on, the constant pitch and roll of autumn seas. Women clutched rosaries, photographs, letters they'd written but couldn't send. Helene kept a small journal hidden in her sock, writing by whatever light filtered through the ventilation grates. October 3rd, 1944. We crossed to Scotland. I cannot imagine what waits for us there. My father died in a British prison camp in the last war. Will they take that revenge on his daughter? The Scottish coast appeared through fog like something from a ghost story. Grey cliffs, grey water, grey sky, everything the colour of despair. The port was Aberdeen, docks lined with cranes and warehouses, British soldiers everywhere moving with the casual efficiency of men who'd been at war so long they'd forgotten peace. The women stumbled down gangplanks into cold that cut through their thin dresses, breath visible in the October air. British soldiers lined the dock, but not the sadists of propaganda. These were men who looked tired rather than cruel, many wearing the ribbons of North Africa and Italy campaigns. Their uniforms were worn but maintained. Weapons held without aggression. One soldier, his face scarred from burns, steadied an older German woman who missed her footing on the wet planks. His hand was impersonal but not unkind. Helene watched this and felt something shift in her understanding, not collapse but crack, like ice beginning to break up in spring. The transport lorries drove south through landscape unlike anything in Germany. Wild moorland stretching to horizons broken only by stone walls older than nations. Heather turning brown with autumn. Lochs reflecting clouds like mirrors of Mercury. A country that seemed untouched by war. No bomb craters, no burned villages. Just ancient land going about its business while humans killed each other across the continent. Where are they taking us? Greta Muller whispered in German. She was 23, a radio operator from Hamburg, young enough to still believe rescue might come. Somewhere we can't escape, someone answered, But escape to what? To a Germany being crushed between Soviet and Allied armies, to cities reduced to ash, to a Reich that was collapsing into the nightmare it had created. The camp emerged from pine forest like a frontier outpost. Rows of wooden barracks arranged in precise lines, surrounded by chain-link fence that seemed almost decorative compared to the concrete and electric wire of camps back home. Guard towers stood at intervals, but the sentries inside read newspapers, smoked pipes, looked more bored than vigilant. The commandant was a British Army colonel named James MacLeod, a Scot with the weathered face of someone who'd spent too many years in harsh climates. He stood at the camp headquarters as the lorries arrived, his uniform pressed despite the persistent drizzle, his expression revealing nothing. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention," he said through a translator, a middle-aged woman whose German carried a Berlin accent from before the Nazis. "You will work on assigned details. You will be fed British military rations. You will be housed according to international law. And you will be protected." He paused, letting the words settle. Protected means no harm will come to you while you're in His Majesty's custody. The guards have orders. Any violation results in court-martial and prison time. The German women stood in formation, rain beginning to fall harder, trying to process these words. Protected, fed, housed by law. It had to be theatre, some elaborate British performance before the real treatment began. Colonel MacLeod dismissed them to their barracks. The buildings were utilitarian but weatherproof. Iron beds with thin mattresses that smelled of disinfectant. Small stoves for heating. Windows that actually opened. In the corner of each barracks, a radio played BBC broadcasts. British voices discussing the war with measured objectivity, reporting German defeats without gloating, as if describing cricket scores rather than the destruction of nations. "This is how they break you," Frau Becker muttered. She was older, perhaps 50, and her husband, an officer with Army Group Centre. "They give you comfort, make you soft, then the punishment comes." But days passed, and the punishment never arrived. Morning came with reveille at 6 o'clock a.m. Roll call in the compound yard, Scottish mist clinging to everything, the world grey and wet in ways that felt permanent. British guards counted the women with bureaucratic precision, then directed them to the mess hall. This was where the first real shock occurred. The mess hall was a long wooden building with a tin roof that amplified rain into constant percussion. Women filed in, expecting the starvation rations that defined late-war Europe. Bread made from sawdust and potato peels. Soup that was mostly water, with rumours of vegetables. Perhaps some turnip if you were lucky. Instead, they found trays loaded with porridge, eggs, bread with butter, tea with milk and sugar. Real food in quantities that weren't generous by peacetime standards, but were impossible by 1944, German reality. Helene stared at her plate as if it might be a hallucination. Around her, women sat frozen, afraid this was a test or a trap. One woman began crying quietly, tears falling into her porridge. A British guard serving the line, a man with grey in his hair and kind eyes behind thick spectacles, noticed their hesitation. He spoke no German, but his gesture was universal. He picked up a spoon, mimed eating, smiled gently, moved to the next woman. Permission granted without words. The women ate carefully, some becoming sick from sudden richness after months of near starvation during the chaotic retreat through Belgium. Others ate slowly, deliberately, committing each bite to memory. The porridge was thick and warm and tasted like childhood. The eggs were soft and rich. The tea was bitter and sweet and ordinary and miraculous. In Germany, people were eating rats, tree bark, anything to survive. Here, prisoners ate better than German soldiers at the front. The work assignments came after breakfast. Some women were sent to the laundry, others to the kitchens, still others to maintenance work around the camp. The labour was real, but not crushing. 8-hour shifts with rest breaks. Water and tea provided constantly. Supervisors who corrected mistakes without cruelty, as if training employees rather than exploiting prisoners. And everywhere, British guards going about their duties with professional detachment. They patrolled the fence line, monitored work details, maintained security. But they didn't threaten, didn't exploit their power, didn't use proximity to women as an opportunity. This absence of abuse confused the prisoners more than violence would have. Everything they'd been taught about British degeneracy, about how democracy made soldiers undisciplined, about what happened to women in enemy hands, all of it was proving false with each ordinary day. Helene began to observe systematically, recording details in her hidden journal. The guards rotated on 8-hour shifts. The senior NCO was a sergeant named Donald Fraser, a man from Edinburgh who'd fought at Dunkirk and carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who'd survived when many hadn't. He walked the camp twice daily, checking conditions, talking with guards, occasionally speaking to prisoners through the translator. His manner was neither friendly nor hostile, just professional. War was his job, and he did it without adding unnecessary suffering. One afternoon in November, Colonel MacLeod announced new privileges. Prisoners could receive mail from Germany, send letters home through Red Cross channels, even receive small packages if they arrived. This was dangerous. Contact with home meant learning the truth about conditions there, meant confronting the reality that being a prisoner in Scotland was better than being free in the Reich. The letters that arrived painted pictures of hell. Cities bombed to rubble. Families eating grass and boiled leather. Children dying of diseases that antibiotics could cure if antibiotics existed. The Eastern Front collapsing. Refugees fleeing west with stories of Soviet revenge that made propaganda seem understated. Helene's letter from her sister in Berlin described trading her wedding ring for a loaf of bread, sleeping in subway tunnels during air raids, watching neighbours starve. The letter ended. "You are blessed to be in Britain. At least the British remember they are civilised." This created a psychological inversion almost impossible to bear. The prisoners were safer, healthier, better fed than their families at home. Being captured by the enemy was salvation. The guilt from this realisation settled over the barracks like the Scottish mist, cold and inescapable and suffocating. It was during this period of guilt and confusion that the air raid siren first sounded. November 15th, 1944. A Tuesday afternoon, sky already darkening though it was barely 4 o'clock. The siren began its wail, rising and falling like some ancient warning of doom. Women in the dining hall froze, spoons suspended, faces turning toward windows. They knew this sound. It meant death was coming from above, meant buildings would collapse, meant fire and smoke and terror in darkness. And they knew what guards did during air raids. Guards saved themselves. Guards locked prisoners in and ran. Guards chose their own lives over those they were paid to watch. This was what happened in Germany. This was what Goebbels said happened in democratic countries, where soldiers had no discipline, no sense of duty beyond self-preservation. But the British Guards didn't run. Sergeant Fraser appeared in the dining hall doorway, his voice carrying over the siren's wail. "Everyone remain calm. This is a precautionary alert. RAF tracking unidentified aircraft north of here. Likely lost or damaged German bombers returning from raids on shipyards. Shelter protocol is as follows." He spoke in English, the translator rendering his words quickly into German. "You will proceed in orderly fashion to the shelter trenches along the western fence line. Take your coats. Take nothing else. Guards will lead you. Stay together. If anyone falls or is injured, alert the nearest guard immediately. Is this understood?" The women nodded, too shocked to speak. The guards were staying. The guards were leading them to shelter. The guards were taking responsibility for their safety. This couldn't be real. This had to be some British trick, some psychological operation to lull them into false security before the betrayal. But Sergeant Fraser was already moving, organising, directing guards to each barracks. "Stewart, take barracks 1 and 2, Michaels 3 and 4. Thompson, check the work details and bring them in. I want everyone accounted for in 5 minutes. The women filed out of the dining hall into cold November air. The siren continued its wail. Guards appeared at each barracks, not with rifles pointed, but with flashlights in hand, calling women out, counting heads, organizing them into groups. The discipline was remarkable. No panic, no shouting, just calm efficiency. The shelter trenches were along the western fence, zigzag ditches about 6 feet deep with wooden frames overhead and earth piled on top. Basic but solid, dug according to specifications learned from years of German bombing. The women climbed down wooden steps into the trenches, guards directing them, ensuring everyone had space, that no one was crushed or separated from their group. Helene found herself in a section of trench with about 20 other women. A guard remained at the entrance above them, a young soldier named Corporal Davies, who couldn't have been more than 22. He held a flashlight and a checklist, counting heads, marking names. "Everyone all right down there?" he called in English. The translator, who'd been directed to this section, repeated the question in German. "Yes," voices called back, uncertain, afraid. The wait began. Cold November air seeping into the trench, the siren still wailing overhead. Women pressed together for warmth, for comfort, for the animal reassurance of other bodies in darkness. Some prayed quietly. Others wept. Helene sat with her back against the dirt wall, trying to understand what was happening. The guards had brought them to shelter. The guards were staying with them. This violated everything she'd been taught about British cowardice. Above them, they could hear Corporal Davies speaking to someone else. Another guard, asking for status. "All accounted for in Section 3. 21 women, all calm, no injuries." His voice was steady, professional, as if this was just another duty. 15 minutes passed. 20. The cold became worse, seeping through clothes, making fingers numb. One of the younger women began to hyperventilate, panic overtaking reason. "I can't breathe. The walls are too close. I need to get out." Corporal Davies heard the commotion. He climbed part way down the steps, flashlight illuminating the trench. "What's happening?" Through the translator. "She's panicking. Afraid of enclosed spaces." Davies didn't hesitate. He came fully into the trench, approached the panicking woman, kept his distance, but spoke directly. The translator followed his words. "Look at me. You're safe. The walls aren't closing. You're breathing fine. I need you to count with me. 1, 2, 3. He counted slowly, deliberately, his calm voice cutting through her panic. The woman focused on him, on his face, on the sound of counting. Her breathing slowed. 4, 5, 6. That's good. Keep going. 7. Helene watched this interaction and felt another crack in her understanding. This British soldier was using his time, his effort, his compassion on an enemy prisoner having a panic attack. He could have ignored her, let her suffer, even struck her to make her quiet. Instead, he treated her as a human being in distress. After 30 minutes, the all clear sounded. A different siren, steady rather than wailing, the signal that danger had passed. The tension in the trench released like a held breath. Corporal Davies climbed back up the steps. "All clear. We'll exit in organised fashion. Wait for your turn." The women climbed out of the trenches in groups, guards ensuring no one was injured, that the count remained accurate. As they emerged, they saw what had happened. No bombs had fallen on or near the camp. The German aircraft had continued east, likely damaged and trying to reach occupied Norway or making for home fields. The threat had been potential rather than real, but the British response had been as if the danger was imminent and deadly. Back in the barracks that evening, the women were quiet, processing what had occurred. "They protected us," Greta Müller said, her voice uncertain. "During an air raid, they could have locked us in and saved themselves. But they took us to shelter. They stayed with us." "It was probably just regulations," Frau Becker insisted. "Geneva Convention requirements. They had no choice." But her voice lacked conviction. The British could have followed regulations minimally, locked them somewhere and left. Instead, they'd organised, sheltered, stayed, even comforted a panicking prisoner. Helene wrote in her journal that night, November 15th, 1944. Today I learned that British guards will protect their prisoners even during air raids. This should not be remarkable. But after years of propaganda about British cowardice and democratic weakness, it feels like witnessing something impossible. How many other lies have we been told? The air raids became more frequent as November turned to December. German bombers increasingly desperate, fleeing Allied fighters, jettisoning bombs anywhere to gain altitude, navigating by dead reckoning toward home. Each time the siren sounded, the same ritual occurred. Guards organised prisoners, led them to shelters, stayed with them until the all clear. It became routine, but the routine itself was revolutionary. British soldiers repeatedly choosing duty over self-preservation. Helene began to know Corporal Davies during these shelter periods. Not truly know, boundaries remained, but something like acquaintance. He was from Wales, from a village whose name she couldn't pronounce. He'd worked in coal mines before the war, enlisted in 1941, served in North Africa until malaria forced his return to Britain and assignment to guard duty. During one air raid in early December, she asked through the translator why he didn't seek better shelter for himself, why he stayed with the prisoners in the trench. Davies looked surprised by the question. "It's my duty, isn't it? You're prisoners of war under British protection. That means something. Can't just abandon you when danger comes." In Germany, Helene said carefully, guards would save themselves first. Prisoners are expendable. Davies shook his head. Then Germany's lost more than the war. You've lost the thing that makes protecting worth the cost. We fight for civilization. That means something even when it's difficult. This answer was too complex for Helene to fully process in the moment, but she wrote it in her journal, turning it over in her mind during the cold December nights. A soldier who believed duty mattered even toward enemies. A system that valued civilization even under pressure. These were not weaknesses. These were strengths that Nazi ideology had taught her to despise. The transformation didn't happen suddenly. It accumulated like Scottish rain, constant and gradual, eventually saturating everything. Small moments adding up to fundamental change. A guard named Private Morrison, who taught some of the younger German women to play darts during recreation time, patient with their mistakes, laughing at his own. A cook who always gave extra porridge to women who looked thin, never expecting thanks or recognition. Sergeant Fraser, who walked through the barracks during a cold snap, ensuring the stoves were working, that everyone had adequate blankets. But the air raid sheltering remained the most powerful evidence. Each time the siren wailed, the same response. Guards organising, protecting, staying, never abandoning their posts, never choosing their own safety over prisoner welfare. By mid-December, even the most sceptical women, even Frau Becker, had to acknowledge what this meant. The British were not cowards. Democracy had not made them weak. Something in their system made them stronger than the supposedly superior Nazi discipline. December brought the worst raid. The 18th, a Monday evening, darkness already complete at 5 o'clock. The siren sounded during dinner, but this time, as women filed toward the shelter trenches, they heard it. The sound of aircraft engines, close and growing closer. Not the steady drone of RAF bombers heading out, but the uneven sputter of damaged German planes trying to stay aloft. Sergeant Fraser's voice cut through the rising panic. "Double time to the shelters. No running, no pushing. Guards, maintain order. We've got maybe 2 minutes before they're overhead." The women moved faster but didn't panic, following the drills they'd practiced, trusting the guards who'd proven trustworthy. Into the trenches, down the steps, packed tighter than before. Helene's section had 25 women this time, more than comfortable capacity. Corporal Davies was there again, counting heads, checking the overhead cover, ensuring structural integrity. Then they heard it. The whistle of falling bombs. Not close, but not far enough. The sound every European knew by late 1944. The sound that meant death was looking for an address. Women screamed. Some tried to climb back out of the trench in blind panic. Davies moved fast, blocking the stairs, not with force, but with presence. "Stay down! The shelter will protect you! Stay down!" The explosions came. Not direct hits, but close enough to shake the ground, to send dirt cascading from the trench walls, to make ears ring and hearts stop. The sound was massive, primal, the earth itself being torn apart. Women pressed against each other, some praying, some simply breathing, trying to exist through each second. Another whistle. Another explosion, this one closer. The trench shook violently. The wooden frame overhead creaked ominously. Dust and dirt rained down. Panic rose like floodwater, about to overwhelm all rational thought. Davies stood at the trench entrance, exposed to anything that might fall, his flashlight steady. "You're safe. The shelter's holding. You're safe." His voice was calm, absolutely calm, an anchor in chaos. A third explosion, further away this time. The bombers passing over, jettisoning their loads in desperation, not caring where they fell, just trying to lighten their aircraft enough to limp home. The sound of engines faded, became distant, disappeared into winter night. Silence fell, broken only by whimpering, by ragged breathing, by the sound of women crying in relief and fear and confusion. Corporal Davies remained at the entrance for 5 full minutes, ensuring the threat had passed, that no secondary explosions would occur, that rescue could begin if needed. Only then did he move. "All clear hasn't sounded yet, but I'm going to check for damage. Stay here until official signal." He climbed out of the trench, and they heard him calling to other guards, checking status, organising assessment. Women remained huddled in darkness, processing what had happened. The bombs had fallen on or near the camp. The British guards had stayed with them throughout. Corporal Davies had stood exposed at the trench entrance, his body between them and danger, talking them through panic, proving with his presence that they weren't abandoned. When the all clear finally sounded, they climbed out to find damage. One of the storage buildings had taken a direct hit, now burning despite the rain that had begun to fall. The fence line was damaged in 2 places, but the barracks were intact. The shelters had held. Not a single prisoner had been injured. 3 guards had minor wounds from flying debris. They were being treated by the camp medic, refusing to make a fuss, as if being wounded while protecting prisoners was simply part of the job. Helene stood in the rain watching the storage building burn, watching British soldiers organise firefighting efforts, watching Corporal Davies direct women back to barracks with the same calm he'd shown in the trench. She thought about her father, who died in a British camp in the last war. She thought about everything Goebbels had said about British cruelty and cowardice. She thought about Corporal Davies standing at the trench entrance, his body a shield, his voice an anchor. That night, she wrote the longest entry in her journal. December 18th, 1944. Today bombs fell on the camp. The guards could have run to better shelter. They could have locked us in our barracks and saved themselves. Instead, they took us to the trenches and stayed with us through the bombardment. Corporal Davies stood at our shelter entrance, exposed, keeping us calm while death fell from the sky. I cannot reconcile this with anything I was taught about the British. I cannot reconcile this with propaganda about democratic weakness. These men have shown more courage, more discipline, more honour than I ever witnessed in the SS. What does this mean? What does any of it mean? In the days after the raid, something shifted in the camp. The women stopped viewing the guards as temporary custodians before inevitable cruelty. They began to see them as men who took their duty seriously, who had chosen to protect even when protection carried cost. Conversations started tentatively through the translator initially, then in broken English as women learned phrases and guards learned a few German words. Greta Muller approached Private Morrison one afternoon after he'd helped clear rubble from the damaged fence. Through a combination of German, English, and gestures, she managed to ask why he'd stayed during the raid, why he hadn't sought better shelter. Morrison, who'd been at Dunkirk and carried scars that ran deeper than skin, considered the question seriously. Because someone has to prove that civilization matters, that rules matter even in war. If we'd run, we'd be no better than what we're fighting against. What would be the point of victory then? The women received more letters from Germany, each one worse than the last. Berlin under constant bombardment, the Eastern Front collapsing, Soviet armies sweeping west, stories of atrocities that made propaganda seem weak. Food gone, fuel gone, hope gone. Germany was being erased, day by day, city by city, the consequence of choices made by leaders who'd promised a 1,000-year Reich and delivered less than 12 years of increasing hell. Christmas approached and Colonel MacLeod approved a small celebration. Nothing elaborate, but the mess hall would be decorated. There would be extra rations. Women could sing carols if they wished. This small gesture of normalcy in abnormal circumstances created strange emotions. These were enemy soldiers, technically, being given Christmas dinner by men whose cities Germany had bombed, whose comrades Germany had killed. On Christmas Eve, the women gathered in the mess hall. Simple decorations, evergreen branches, and paper chains made during recreation time. The meal was better than usual: roast chicken, potatoes, vegetables, even a small piece of cake for each woman. Guards served the food as they did every meal, professional, quiet. Sergeant Fraser stood at the front of the hall as women finished eating. Colonel MacLeod asked me to convey his Christmas wishes. He hopes that next year finds all of you home with your families, finds all of us returned to peace, finds the world recovered from this madness. The translator rendered his words carefully. Some women cried. Others sat in silence, processing kindness from enemies. After the meal, women sang carols, German carols in German, their voices blending in harmonies that carried longing for home, for peace, for a world that made sense. The guards listened respectfully, some removing their caps, recognizing sacred music even in an enemy language. When the women finished Stille Nacht, Private Morrison began to sing in English. Silent Night. The same song, same melody, different language. Other guards joined him. For 3 minutes, British and German voices sang together, the same Christmas carol, the same longing for peace expressed in different words. Helene cried then, really cried, understanding that they were all trapped in the same tragedy, all victims of decisions made by men far away who'd never faced the consequences of their choices. January 1945 brought news that the war was ending. Soviet forces pushing toward Berlin, Allied armies across the Rhine. Germany's collapse was no longer theoretical, but imminent and certain. The women would be repatriated eventually, sent home to whatever remained. But home was rubble and starvation and Soviet occupation. Being here, prisoners in Scotland, was safer than being free in Germany. The inversion was complete and crushing. One evening in late January, during recreation time, Helene approached Corporal Davies. Her English was better now, good enough for simple conversation without the translator. "I need to tell you something," she said carefully. He nodded, gestured to a bench near the stove. They sat, maintaining that respectful distance that had defined all their interactions. "Before the war," she said slowly, choosing words carefully, "I believed what they taught us, that Germany was superior, that other nations were weak or corrupt, that showing mercy was weakness, that strength meant domination without conscience." She paused, gathering courage. "And I believed what they said about the British, that you were cowards, that democracy made you soft, that you would abandon prisoners to save yourselves." Davies listened without interrupting. "I worked at a weather station," Helene continued. "I tracked conditions for bombing missions. I helped German bombers find British cities. I told myself it was just weather data, Not my responsibility what they did with the information. I told myself many lies to avoid facing what my work meant. The silence stretched between them like a bridge. Outside, Scottish wind rattled windows, carrying the promise of snow. I cannot undo what I believed. I cannot undo what I contributed to. But I want you to know that I see now. I see that your strength was not weakness. I see that our supposed superiority was actually brutality. And I am more ashamed than I have words to express. Davies was quiet for a long time, his face unreadable in the dim light. Finally, he spoke. Shame is easy. It's the simplest emotion after hate. You feel bad, you apologize, you think that's enough. He paused. But living differently is harder. Going home and choosing different when everyone else wants the old ways back, that takes real courage. Will you forgive me? Helene asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Davies looked at her directly. That's not mine to give. The people who died in your bombing raids, the ones who burned in London and Coventry and Glasgow, they're the ones you need forgiveness from. Most of them are gone now. Then what do I do? You live differently. When you go home and people start making the same mistakes, you speak up. You tell them what you learned here. You become the kind of person who would have resisted, who would have said no, who would have chosen the harder path. He stood to leave. You asked once why we stayed during the raids. It's because we believe people can change. We believe Germany can learn. We believe there's still hope for something better. Don't prove us wrong. Repatriation began in March 1945. Groups of women processed out, given papers, loaded onto lorries heading south to ports, then onto ships heading to a Germany that existed only as a geographic expression. Helene's group was scheduled for April. The last weeks in the camp felt suspended, caught between two worlds, neither fully prisoner nor fully free. On the final evening, there was no formal ceremony, just quiet acknowledgements between people who'd shared strange intimacy. Some women shook hands with guards they'd come to respect. A few exchanged addresses, knowing they'd probably never write. Most simply nodded, recognizing what had passed between them. Greta Müller found Private Morrison, who'd taught her darts and made her laugh during the darkest days. Her English was good enough now to say, "Thank you for showing me that enemies can also be human." He smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. Take care of yourself over there. Build something better than what you left. Helene found Corporal Davies one last time. They stood near the gates where they'd talked so many evenings, the April night soft with the promise of spring. I will remember this place, she said. I will remember what you taught me. Remember what you learned, he corrected gently. I just did my duty. You did the hard work of changing your mind. Will you remember me? He considered this. I'll remember that people can change, that even after terrible things, there's possibility for something different. That's what I'll carry forward. They shook hands formally, the gesture carrying more weight than any embrace could. The next morning, lorries came before dawn. Women loaded their few possessions, letters from home, journals filled with observations that would have been impossible to imagine a year before. They filed out through the gates, past the guard towers where men they'd feared had instead protected them, past the shelter trenches where British soldiers had proved that duty meant something even toward enemies. Colonel MacLeod stood at the gates, saluting as they passed. A small gesture, but meaningful. Respect offered even to defeated enemies. The lorries rolled south through Scotland, waking to spring. Green hills, lambs in fields, villages where ordinary life continued. A country that had been at war for 6 years, but maintained its essential character, choosing civilization even when barbarism would have been easier. The ship back to Germany carried 300 prisoners from various camps. During the crossing, they shared stories. Some men from other camps spoke of harsh treatment, guards who were cruel, conditions that barely met Geneva standards. They were bitter, eager to resurrect old grievances. But the women from the Scottish camp told different stories. Stories of British guards who'd protected them during air raids. Stories of being fed, sheltered, treated with dignity. Stories of learning that everything they'd been taught was a lie. Some didn't believe them, called them collaborators, weak, brainwashed. But others listened, perhaps beginning their own reconsideration. Helene stood at the ship's rail as the German coast appeared, grey and cold under April skies. Beside her, Greta shivered in her thin coat. "Are you afraid?" Greta asked. "Yes," Helene said, "but different than before. Before I was afraid of punishment. Now I'm afraid I won't be strong enough to live differently, that the old ways will be easier, and I'll fall back into them." "Then we help each other," Greta said. "We remember together." The ship docked at Hamburg, or what remained of it. The city was ruins, entire neighbourhoods erased, survivors moving through rubble like ghosts. The women stepped onto German soil, changed. Transformed by captivity in ways liberation never could have accomplished. They had lived among enemies they'd been taught to despise and learned that humanity could survive even the worst propaganda. In the years after, Helena Brandt became a teacher in Stuttgart. She taught meteorology, but honestly, including what weather data had been used for during the war. And she told her students about Scotland, about British guards who'd stayed during air raids, about learning that courage and compassion were not weaknesses, but strengths. Some parents complained, some called her a traitor, but others listened. And slowly, a generation began to learn different lessons than their parents had been taught. Greta Muller married a British soldier during the occupation and moved to Wales. She lived 3 streets from Corporal Davies' family. Their children played together. When old friends in Germany asked how she could live among the British, she wrote back, "Because they're just people. Because everything we were taught was a lie. Because there is no master race, only the human race trying to survive together." Colonel James MacLeod continued serving until his retirement in 1955. He never spoke publicly about his time commanding prisoner camps, but he kept letters from some of the German women, letters describing their new lives, letters of thanks, letters proving that even enemies could learn to see each other's humanity. Corporal Davies returned to Wales and worked in the mines until they closed, then became a union organiser and local councillor. When asked what gave him faith that people could change, that hatred could be overcome, he told the story of German women in a Scottish camp who learned to question everything they'd been taught. What happened in that camp near Inverness, and places like it across Britain, was not widely known for decades. It didn't fit comfortable narratives. It was too complex, too nuanced, too much at odds with simple stories of good versus evil. But it was real. German prisoners, including women, were held in camps across Britain during the war's final years. They were guarded by British soldiers who took their duty seriously, who protected their prisoners even during air raids, even when doing so carried risk. And those encounters between women who'd been taught that the British were cowards and guards who proved that duty mattered became a quiet part of transformation. Not the official denazification program, but something more personal. The daily experience of having your deepest beliefs contradicted by reality, of learning that propaganda was poison, of discovering that your enemies were human beings who chose honour even when cruelty would have been easier. Historians later noted that German prisoners held in Britain often returned with different perspectives than those held elsewhere. They had experienced a country that maintained its values even under extreme pressure, that treated enemies with dignity even while fighting for survival, that proved democracy wasn't weakness, but a different kind of strength. These experiences didn't instantly create Democrats out of Nazis, but they planted seeds of doubt about totalitarian ideology. They proved that propaganda could be overcome by direct experience. They demonstrated that even enemies could be treated with basic decency, and that such treatment could change understanding. The camp where Helene Brandt spent 6 months no longer exists. The barracks were torn down, the land returned to farming. If you visited the site today, you'd see only fields. Perhaps a small memorial noting that a POW camp once stood there. But the impact of what happened in that space continues. Every student Helene taught about choosing truth over comfortable lies. Every child Greta raised to judge people by character rather than nationality. Every person who heard these stories and chose to see humanity in everyone. The German women who encountered British rescue teams during those first air raids expected abandonment. They found protection instead. They expected cowardice. They found duty. They expected confirmation of their prejudices. They found evidence that everything they believed was wrong, and in that gap between expectation and reality, something extraordinary happened. Not dramatic, not cinematic, but real and lasting. People changed their minds. People learned to see differently. People chose to build their lives on new foundations. That is the quiet victory that no army can achieve. That is the transformation that happens one person at a time, one moment at a time, one recognition at a time that the enemy is human too. In the end, it wasn't British military might that defeated Nazism in those women's hearts. It wasn't re-education programs or propaganda. It was the simple experience of being protected by people they'd been taught to despise, of watching British soldiers choose duty over safety, of learning that strength and compassion are not opposites, but complements. That is the lesson that echoes across 80 years. That is the truth that survives when all the hatred is forgotten. That is the hope that remains when everything else has been destroyed. Humanity is not determined by nationality or ideology. It is chosen daily in small acts of courage. It is proven by how we treat those we have power over, especially when no one is watching. It is built by people who, having every reason to choose the easier path, choose something better instead. The women who left that camp in spring 1945 carried that lesson home with them, back to a destroyed nation that desperately needed to learn it. Some shared it, some lived it, some passed it on to children and grandchildren. And somewhere in that chain of transformation, in that quiet accumulation of changed minds and opened hearts, the world became slightly better than it was. Not perfect, not redeemed, but better. And sometimes, in the aftermath of total war, better is enough.